Okay, so today we have hot cross bun. Now I have to tell you that they ran out of the regular hot cross buns, so this is like an apple and cinnamon version. And I'm not sure how I feel about it, if I'm honest. I feel like the original is the best, but it's passable, particularly when it's got butter on it, which is delicious. I'm drinking turmeric tea, which probably was also a mistake. It tastes very healthy, and not in a good way, not like the good kind of healthy, and it stains literally everything, and I'm not sure it's worth it. So I'm here with my questionable hot cross bun and my questionable cup of tea, and I'm going to talk about intergenerational trauma, or my understanding of it, my experience of it. I've noticed there's like a weird thing going on here. Let me see if I can fix that. Oh yeah, it's better. Okay. So yeah, I think before I talk about trauma and intergenerational trauma, I wanted to sort of explain a little bit about my history and how I identify. So I don't identify as white. I am white passing, and that is a huge privilege. It means I walk around the streets, and if I were to meet someone and say, hey, I'm white British, they would never question me. They don't treat me like an outsider on first glance. But I still don't consider myself to be white British, even though I was born in this country. And the reason is this. Well, I suppose it comes down to what your beliefs are when it comes to race. So for me, there are certain things that are just genetic facts. So, for example, my species, the species I belong to, you can study my DNA, you can study my skull, my anatomy, and you can say this is a human, for sure. You can also study my chromosomes, again, part of my DNA, and you can study my sexual organs, and you can say this person's sex is female. But when it comes to things like gender and race, these are things that we've created, I believe. And actually, I say I believe like I came up with the theory. I didn't know plenty of anthropologists who, have said that before me. And I subscribe to those beliefs. I think that race is something that was created to divide certain groups and to elevate some over others. And so I think when people talk about gender, they have very fixed ideas of what it is to be feminine, what it is to be masculine. And I'm fairly fortunate, very privileged in the sense that I've always really been those things. I've always felt female. I never had an issue to do with my gender, so gender conforming. And I'm aware that not everyone has that privilege. Now, when it comes to race, I think when people talk about a white race, it's not an actual race. What they're talking about is the host majority population. So the assumption, if you say that you're white, is that you're not a minority. You haven't been persecuted or marginalised as a minority, and that you are fully assimilated, and I suppose you don't have that history of persecution and struggle. And that's why I can't say that I'm white, because I do have that history. So I'm first generation British. Both of my parents were economic migrants who came to this country, and both of them had spent time in refugee camps prior to that due to war. Their parents and their grandparents were asylum seekers and genocide survivors. They are from different groups. I would not consider them to be the same race. I would consider myself to be mixed heritage, and their ethnicities, if that's an easier word to kind of use than race, are very distinct. And both my father's family, who were Ottoman Armenians, were persecuted and killed on the basis of their race. And it was called race at the time. And my mother's family, who were Ukrainian Jews and German Jews, suffered incredible persecution, and a lot of them died, although obviously not the ones who survived in order to pass down their genes to me, but a lot of their families died because of, again, what was considered their race. So it seems almost disrespectful to their story as minorities and as persecuted people, to just turn around and be like, yeah, I'm white. It also is my lived experience. While I don't look different to white British people, growing up in school with a lot of white British people, I always felt different. I was always treated as other. We were always the one with, you know, the weird surname no one could pronounce or spell, the weird smells on our clothes from the weird food that our mum would cook, and the weird accents that my parents had. And, you know, my mum was very distinctly different to all the other mums, and I felt as her daughter different. And also being mixed is a weird thing, because you feel different to your own family. Like, you sit down with your cousins and your sisters, well, no, not your sisters. My sister's the only one like me. But you sit down with cousins and uncles and aunts, and they look at you like you're not really one of them. And that's hard, you know. I think the reason my sister popped into my head is because she kind of is the only person that I have that same background, that same culture, that same mix as. To my knowledge, I've never met anyone else like me. So yeah, I don't consider myself white. And the other reason is that I believe that certain groups, diasporic groups, who have had to flee, have been forced to leave their homelands, they carry a kind of trauma that gets passed down to their children and their children. And I've been thinking about intergenerational trauma a lot, and I think that for me, there are two things that I noticed growing up. The first thing is the fear of authority and being persecuted by authority figures. So whenever I walk past a police officer, I sweat. I get really anxious. I'm convinced they're going to arrest me, which is ridiculous. There's nothing about me that, you know, screams criminal, and yet I am convinced that they are going to come for me. And I know that comes from my mum. I know that she was always terrified of the police. I remember once a lorry went into the back of her, crashed into her car, and she went into a full-blown panic. She fled the scene of an accident. She locked herself in the house, absolutely terrified. And it's such an irrational response when she had done nothing wrong. But then you have to realise that her parents, or her father, was a German Jew, and he would have feared authority very legitimately. And that fear got passed down, and it got passed down to me even. And you know, I think that that is part of intergenerational trauma. I think the other thing that I noticed growing up was that there was this kind of disconnect sometimes between like my grandmother and my father, and, you know, that there's like a generational trauma that sort of prevented the adults from fully attaching and bonding with their children. So I had a really good experience of my grandmother as a grandmother, but I don't know what she was like as a parent, and I'm not sure what my grandfather was like as a parent. I imagine he was quite cold and distant from what I've heard. And certainly his father, who was the genocide survivor, he was the one who watched his parents be executed, have their heads cut off in front of him, which is, you know, crazy to imagine that that's what he went through. He was also assaulted. He was, so the people who came on horseback, they had these big Saracen swords, and they literally decapitated these villages. And then my great-grandfather was so little that the sword couldn't quite reach him, so it just gave him these huge gashes on his head. So he had this horrendous trauma. And of course then when he had a child, he wouldn't have been able to bond and love that child in that sort of in a way that maybe I would be able to, just because he had this fear that, you know, the people he loved could be taken from him. And so that trauma would be passed down the generations. And I think certainly if I look at the men in my dad's family, there is that lack of attachment, you know, to, you know, my dad found it so easily to just cut me off. I mean, I think that's part of his personality, but I think it is also part of the trauma that they don't attach to their children correctly. And so yeah, intergenerational trauma is real, and I believe it affects us all, and certainly those of us who have had difficult upbringings and ancestors who had terrible times. So yeah, that's my little spiel about intergenerational trauma and my understanding of it. I'm not an expert. This is just from watching my family and trying to understand how we interact with one another. And that's why I don't consider myself white. So I'm going to eat my toasted hot cross bun now and tell you what I think about the apple and cinnamon concoction. Yeah, it's not good. No. I don't know. Write in the comments your thoughts on hot cross buns. But that's not as good as the original, in my opinion. If you're American and you don't have hot cross buns, or from anywhere that doesn't have hot cross buns, I'm sorry for your loss. They are, not these ones, but they are generally really, really yummy, in my opinion. So that was me trying to make light of a more serious conversation, and to also explain why I've chosen Zombie. So Zombie was written about the traumas experienced by the oppressed minority in Northern Ireland, the Catholics, and the way that the conflict just continued for generations, and still to some degrees is continuing. And I thought the song did a really great job of explaining how even if there isn't fighting like right now, you still are traumatized by the fighting that has gone before. So that was the reason I picked this conversation and this song that is coming up, which I hope that you enjoy more than I'm enjoying my turmeric tea and my weird hot cross bun. So that's all from me now, and I will post the song tomorrow, and then there'll be more music and stories and stuff next week. Okay, bye.